Dapat po munang alamin or matukoy ang pangunahing problema ng bansa upang mapagtuunan ng pansin at mabigyan ng solusyon.
We should have specific goals, do research, and make a policy that is fair for everyone.
Walang problema sa pulisiya. Iayos lang ang pagpapatupad.
Bago patubas ang batas, pag-aralan muna gusto ng government.
Two things, clarity and execution. Both, you need the communication and monitoring.
Recording in progress.
As simple as that.
Mandato ng Philippine Institute for Development Studies o PIDS na gumawa ng mga pag-aaral at pananaliksik ng mga polisiya at programa ng pamahalaan at magbigay ng rekomendasyon sa mga mambabatas sa pagbabalangkas ng mga polisiyang makakatulong sa ating bansa. Sinusulong ng aming ahensya ang evidence-based policy making upang bigyan din ng kahalagahan ng polisiya na batay sa datos at policy research na sumusuri sa tunay na kalagayan ng ating mga komunidad. Napakahalaga ng policy research, lalo na sa mga panahong dumadaan sa krisis ang ating bansa.
Kapag pulisiya ay pinag-aralan, susulong ang bayan.
In need of references for your research? Do you want a digital library that you can access for free anytime and anywhere? You don't have to look far. SERPI is here for you. SERPI is an online database of socioeconomic materials produced by the Philippine Institute for Development Studies. Government agencies, research and academic institutions, and international organizations based in the Philippines. It is the country's first online repository of socioeconomic information, created for policymakers and development practitioners, researchers, educators, and students. To access SERPI, just visit the PIDS website and click the SERPI widget under the Databases tab, or type serp-p.pids.gov.ph. SERPI has a wide variety of materials such as journal articles, books, research papers, working papers, policy notes, audiovisual materials, and more. As of 2022, SERPI has more than 60 partner institutions contributing knowledge resources to the database. SERPI provides a comprehensive coverage of references encompassing 22 research themes: labor and education, gender and development, poverty, technology and innovation, trade and industry, and many more. On the enhanced website of SERPI, you can filter your research by keyword or author, publication type, research theme, or year published, all at the same time. SERPI has more than 7,000 publications and audiovisual materials that you can access and download for free. What are you waiting for? Visit SERPI now. Socioeconomic Research Portal for the Philippines, innovating knowledge exchange and policy research.
So what is PIDS? For over 40 years, the Philippine Institute for Development Studies, or PIDS, has been the country's foremost socioeconomic think tank. It conducts rigorous and objective policy research and analyses that help the government in crafting relevant policies, plans, and programs in support of the country's long-term vision and development goals. PIDS pursues its mandate through three basic programs: research, dissemination, and outreach. Through its research program, PIDS identifies and prioritizes studies, develops proposals, and conducts research on priority areas. The results of these studies are then disseminated through different platforms, publications, online resources, PIDS Corner, seminars, and the Development Policy Research Month, or DPRM, held every September. To shed light on key policy issues, the advice and expertise of the Institute's research fellows are also sought by policymakers, government agencies, private sector, and civil society. Since 1977, PIDS has completed numerous policy studies on a wide range of development topics. This brand of service has then translated to policies and programs that have improved the lives of every Filipino. Philippine Institute for Development Studies, Service Through Policy Research.
Dapat po munang alamin or matukoy ang pangunahing problema ng bansa upang mapagtuunan ng pansin at mabigyan ng solusyon.
We should have specific goals, do research, and make a policy that is fair for everyone.
Walang problema sa pulisiya. Iayos lang ang pagpapatupad.
Bago patubas ang batas, pag-aralan mo na gusto ng government.
Two things, clarity and execution. Both, you need the communication and monitoring. As simple as that.
Mandato ng Philippine Institute for Development Studies o PIDS na gumawa ng mga pag-aaral at pananaliksik ng mga polisiya at programa ng pamalaan at magbigay ng rekomendasyon sa mga mambabatas sa pagbabalangkas ng mga polisiyang makakatulong sa ating bansa. Sinusulong ng aming ahensya ang evidence-based policy making upang bigyan diin ang kahalagahan ng polisiya na batay sa datos at policy research na sumusuri sa tunay na kalagayan ng ating mga komunidad. Napakahalaga ng policy research, lalo na sa mga panahong dumadaan sa krisis ang ating bansa.
Kapag pulisiya ay pinag-aralan, susulong ang bayan.
In need of references for your research? Do you want a digital library that you can access for free anytime and anywhere? You don't have to look far. SERPI is here for you. SERPI is an online database of socioeconomic materials produced by the Philippine Institute for Development Studies. Government agencies, research and academic institutions, and international organizations based in the Philippines. It is the country's first online repository of socioeconomic information, created for policymakers and development practitioners, researchers, educators, and students. To access SERPI, just visit the PIDS website and click the SERPI widget under the Databases tab, or type serp-p.pids.gov.ph. SERPI has a wide variety of materials such as journal articles, books, research papers, working papers, policy notes, audiovisual materials, and more. As of 2022, SERPI has more than 60 partner institutions contributing knowledge resources to the database. SERPI provides a comprehensive coverage of references encompassing 22 research themes: labor and education, gender and development, poverty, technology and innovation, trade and industry, and many more. On the enhanced website of SERPI, you can filter your research by keyword or author, publication type, research theme, or year published, all at the same time. SERPI has more than 7,000 publications and audiovisual materials that you can access and download for free. What are you waiting for? Visit SERPI now. Socioeconomic research portal for the Philippines, innovating knowledge exchange and policy research.
So what is PIDS? For over 40 years, the Philippine Institute for Development Studies, or PIDS, has been the country's foremost socioeconomic think tank. It conducts rigorous and objective policy research and analyses that help the government in crafting relevant policies, plans, and programs in support of the country's long-term vision and development goals. PIDS pursues its mandate through three basic programs: research, dissemination, and outreach. Through its research program, PIDS identifies and prioritizes studies, develops proposals, and conducts research on priority areas. The results of these studies are then disseminated through different platforms, publications, online resources, PIDS Corner, seminars, and the Development Policy Research Month, or DPRM, held every September. To shed light on key policy issues, the advice and expertise of the Institute's research fellows are also sought by policymakers, government agencies, private sector, and civil society. Since 1977, PIDS has completed numerous policy studies on a wide range of development topics. This brand of service has then translated to policies and programs that have improved the lives of every Filipino. Philippine Institute for Development Studies, service through policy research.
Welcome to the PIDS webinar series. Before we start our virtual event, we have some reminders. For attendees, your microphone is automatically muted upon entry. If you wish to join the discussion, click the Q&A icon, type your question, and click send. For Facebook viewers, you may send your question using the comment section. Remember to keep your questions concise and direct to the point. We will screen all questions to ensure that they are relevant to the webinar topic and the presentation. The moderator will read the questions during the open forum and cover as many as possible depending on the available time. This webinar is being recorded and live streamed on the PIDS and SERPI Facebook pages. The recording will also be made publicly available on the PIDS YouTube channel. Thank you for joining us, and we look forward to your active participation.
Good morning. Please settle down as we are about to start. Okay, excellent. Again, good morning and welcome to this hybrid seminar that we have entitled Metrics Matter, Assessing Progress Towards Women's Empowerment in Agriculture and Beyond. Today's event is in partnership with IFPRI, or the International Food Policy Research Institute. I'm Sonny Domingo, Senior Research Fellow. I'll be your host and moderator this morning. So women in agriculture contribute through paid labor in the fields and unpaid work in their respective households. Despite this, the benefits that women receive are still significantly lower than their male counterparts. Today, we look at women empowerment and the methodologies developed and applied by our researchers to assess such. So before we begin, we invite you to actively engage through our online platforms, Zoom and Facebook Live, as well as through our face-to-face participants here at PIDS. So ask your questions and interact with our panelists through the Q&A box of Zoom and the comment section of Facebook Live. To formally start our program, let us welcome the PIDS President, Dr. Aniceto Orbeta Jr., to give his opening remarks.
Morning, everyone. To participants here in the hall and those joining the Zoom and Facebook pages. Welcome to our hybrid seminar titled Metrics Matter, Assessing Progress Towards Women's Empowerment in Agriculture and Beyond, held in partnership, as mentioned by Sunny, with the International Food Policy Research Institute. Before we formally start, I would like to acknowledge the following esteemed officials present on-site and online. Department of Agriculture, Gender Equality and Social Inclusion, Deputy Executive Director, Anari Rivera. Department of Science and Technology Director, Romeo Ongpoy. Department of Agrarian Reform, Director, Ramon Lacambra. Pamantasan ng Lungsod ng Maynila, Acting Dean, College of Public Administration, Noemi Gucoyo. Pangasinan State University Department Chair, Rinovic Ripolio. People's Development Institute President, Aurea Miklat Tives. KO Philippines Country Representative Felipe. Action for Economic Reforms President Jessica Cantos. And Moro Against Racial Injustice Alliance Movement President Zainab Tando. I would also like to greet those who are various representatives from government, academia, and private sectors, civil society, and media virtually present here today. Today, our guest presenters will share valuable insights from the 3 studies on women's empowerment, especially in the context of agricultural development, and discuss methods for effectively evaluating the degree of empowerment among women in this sector. Women play vital roles in agriculture, yet their contributions often go unrecognized. According to 2019 data of the Philippine Statistics Authority, 2.24 million women are employed in agriculture sector, making up about 13% of the total female employment. Today, despite their significant involvement, Filipino women in agriculture face challenges that hinder the well-being. Study of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy found that while women farmers in the Philippines are second most empowered in Southeast Asia in terms of production, they are least empowered when it comes to time management and relief from labor-intensive tasks. This imbalance negatively impacts their overall well-being and health, as many women are overburdened by the dual responsibilities of farming and household chores. Furthermore, the 2020 PIDS study revealed a significant wage gap between men and women in agriculture, with women earning an average 234 pesos per day compared to 307 pesos for men. This disparity is echoed in a study by Food and Fertilizer Technology Center, which found that women are often relegated to lower paying roles such as planting and weeding, while men dominate higher paying jobs like plowing, land preparation, and irrigation. This study also highlighted that men tend to own more land and financial capital, while women holding only 31% of land ownership as of 2019. Although policies including agrarian reforms have begun to acknowledge women's rights in agriculture, inequalities in labor and compensation persist, continuing to marginalize women. Today's discussion are crucial for assessing the current state of women's empowerment in the agricultural sector and refining our evaluation methods. By doing so, we can develop and implement policies that better support women in achieving fair working conditions, and greater representation in agriculture. This morning, we are honored to welcome esteemed presenters from IFPRI. Our first presenter, IFPRI Senior Research Fellow, Dr. Agnes Quisumbing, my senior in grad school. We'll discuss 2 co-authored studies on women's empowerment in agricultural development projects in South Asia and Africa. Following her, IFPRI Senior Research Coordinator, Dr. Hazel Malapit, will present on the development of women's empowerment metric for national statistical systems, a tool designed to address gender data gap in agricultural development. Also joining us are distinguished discussants from PIDS, former President Dr. Celia Reyes, who will participate via Zoom, and Senior Research Fellow Dr. Jose Ramon Albert, who is with us in the conference hall. I hope that today's seminar sheds light on the gaps we need to address concerning both women and workers in agriculture. Ultimately, ensuring well-being of women in agriculture will strengthen the sector as a whole, supporting our nation's pursuit for a sustained development. Thank you, and I look forward to a fruitful discussion.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rivera. So we are excited to hear the presentations from our invited guests, but it is our tradition to ask a very quick poll question before our formal presentations. So as mentioned earlier, our discussion will tackle women empowerment in agriculture and beyond. With that, the poll question is, do you think that women in the Philippine agriculture are already fully empowered? So again, just to have an abridged version of that question. Are women in agriculture empowered in the Philippines? So you may answer yes or no very quickly. We'll give you around 30 seconds to answer. So for those joining via Zoom, kindly click the link provided in the chat box, and those joining via Facebook Live, kindly click the link provided in the comment section. Again, the question is, are women in agriculture empowered in the Philippines? Yes or no? Okay, so I think we have almost 200 participants via Zoom, Facebook Live, and here, face-to-face at PIDS. So plenty of audience participation to be expected later on. All right, so we have the result of our very quick poll question. You answered, well, most of you answered no. 8 answered yes, 6 answered maybe. So I guess we are not doing that well in terms of empowering our women in agriculture. And that says a lot, no, in terms of how open our culture is in terms of women participation. Okay, so let's go to the formal part of our seminar today. Today's event is divided into presentations, which will feature 3 studies on women empowerment. Our first presentation, titled Assessing Progress Towards Women's Empowerment in Agricultural Development Projects Portfolios in Africa and Asia, will cover the 2 studies. The first study, titled Enhancing Agency Empowerment in Agricultural Development Projects, a synthesis of mixed methods, impact evaluations from the Gender, Agriculture, and Assets Project, Phase 2, or GAAP2, synthesizes findings from 11 agricultural projects across South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa, focuses on assessing how these projects impact women's empowerment using a tool called the Women's Empowerment in Agriculture Index, or pro-WEAI. This index combines quantitative measures with qualitative methods to understand how these projects influence women's empowerment. The second study, assessing multi-country programs through a rich benefit empower transform lens, analyzes a multi-country program's impact on women's empowerment in Ethiopia, Niger, Nepal, and Kyrgyzstan, using a framework called Rich Benefit Empower Transform. It found that the programs improved women's empowerment and gender parity, especially in collective agencies due to its group-based approach. However, overall workload impacts were mostly null, with trade-offs between productive and reproductive work, leading to unintended increases in women's workloads. So we are very lucky today to have with us Dr. Agnes Quisumbing, one of the co-authors of these studies, to present their findings and recommendations. Let me introduce Dr. Agnes. Dr. Agnes is a senior research fellow in the Poverty, Gender, and Inclusion Unit of IFPRI, co-leading research on how closing the gender asset gap can improve development outcomes. She evaluates agricultural development programs in South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa, focusing on gender asset inequality. Her past work at IFPRI examined poverty dynamics and resource allocation within households. She has studied women's land rights in Ghana, the Philippines, and Sumatra. She joined IFPRI in 1995, having previously worked at the University of the Philippines, the World Bank, Yale University, and the International Rice Research Institute. She holds a PhD and MA in economics from the University of the Philippines and an AB in economics from De La Salle University. Thank you for joining us today, Dr. Agnes. You may now begin your presentation.
Umaga, and thank you for the nice introduction. Okay, let's see. How do I turn this on? How do I turn this on? Okay, it's on. Okay, great. So it's really nice to be able to return to PIDS, even if not in the building that I know and love. I don't know whether the building still exists. It does? It's not safe for human habitation. Okay. So I'm presenting on joint work by a very large team of co-authors on our work on developing women's empowerment indices and using them to evaluate the impact of agricultural development projects. And I really like the slide that you did with which has pictures of all the co-authors because it shows the collective nature of this enterprise. So I realized this morning as I was thinking about my presentation that instead of putting an elephant here, I should perhaps have put a turtle. The reason I put an elephant is that it's really the story of the blind man, the 5 or 7 blind men, the elephant, trying to understand what the elephant is, but they can't because they're blind. They can see, okay, one is a rope, one's a tail, it's a ball, it's a what, and they really can't get at this multi-dimensional thing, which is an elephant. I did think about using a turtle, but since I had already sent my PowerPoint, I did not do it because I love turtles, but also to illustrate actually the slow pace of progress towards women's empowerment. And maybe in my next iteration of the slide, and you will understand when you see the results, why maybe the turtle might have been a more appropriate symbol. Okay. Hello. Why is this not advancing? There. Okay. So to understand empowerment, I think it's important to define it because unless we come up with a common definition, it's hard to measure it. And we actually take a definition which comes from Naila Kabir, which splits up empowerment into 3 components: agency, resources, and achievements. Empowerment, she defines empowerment as a process by which people make and take strategic life decisions, especially in a context where it's been denied to them. And the 3 components here are agency, the capacity to define one's own goals and to make choices to pursue these goals, especially if they were unable to do so in the past. Resources are the various material, human, and social resources that serve to enhance one's ability to exercise choice. And achievements, of course, are the achievements of one's goals. Now, in our work on measuring women's empowerment, we really focused on measures of agency. And the reason is that there are already well-established measures of resources and achievements. I mean, look at any data set, a typical household survey will give you lots of stuff on resources, not necessarily sex disaggregated, but those measures to exist. And achievements, many of the achievements, for example, like human capital outcomes, etc., are already sex disaggregated, but agency is tough to measure. It's the elephant in the room. So I was asked to give a brief introduction to these empowerment indices before going to how they're being used in impact evaluations. So I would say like the big mama of women's empowerment indices that we've developed is the Women's Empowerment Agriculture Index, which we co-developed with USAID and the Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiative in 2012. It measures inclusion of women in agricultural sector growth. The important thing is that it's survey-based and based on interviews of men and women in the same household. This is different from other gender gap indices, for example, like the one of the World Economic Forum or the one of UNDP, which is based on aggregate data. And the importance about having this data on men and women within the household is that we can look at gender parity. And it's the original WEAI was designed to look at decision-making control over livelihoods, resources, and income, both sole and joint, mostly in agriculture and in population-based surveys. You will see in a bit that WEAI has 5 domains of empowerment, which 5DE, and because we collect it for men and women, we can compute a gender parity index. So in terms of the evolution, when USAID asked us to develop this, they had pretty much predefined these 5 domains as production, resources, income, leadership, and time. And the reason behind this was that these were the areas that they hoped that the Future Initiative were going to affect. So it is more of a practical approach to defining the domains rather than a theoretical approach or conceptually based approach, even if the indicators themselves, of course, were based on theoretical concepts of measurement and all the like. So the production domain in the original had input into production decisions and autonomy in production. Autonomy in production is a bit misleading because it actually refers to the motivation for undertaking this task, whether it's internally motivated or it's because you're being pressured by other people, to put it that way. Resources comprised ownership of assets, purchase, sale, or transfer of assets, and access to and decision credit. We had only one indicator in the income domain, which is control over use of income. The leadership domain had whether you're a member in a group and comfort in speaking in public. And the time domain had workload based on a 24-hour recall survey and one's satisfaction with leisure time. So I will note that each of these indicators is actually made up of individual items. So it's not just, just don't ask you, do you have control or income or not? It's actually an indicator based on responses to several items, and then we rate people according to their adequacy with respect to each indicator. Now, in the process of rolling this out to the 19 Feed the Future countries, USAID came across complaints, of course, that, oh God, this survey is so long. So, okay, how do we shorten it? So first, one approach was to get rid of the questions that were problematic or difficult to administer in the field. And one of them was speaking in public. So in countries which had histories of violent political conflict, like Cambodia, this was like, no, you don't ask these questions, so bye. The question of leisure was very hard to interpret, and the time use module already took long to administer, so goodbye to leisure. I hope that's not predictive. And then in the asset ownership module, we dropped because ownership of assets actually confers very strong rights of purchase, sale, and transfer. Those were combined. And so we ended up having only 6 indicators over the 5 domains. Okay, so the 5 domains of empowerment are aggregated up with specific weights attached to each of the indicators and comes up to 90% of the score. And then comparing the men and women gives you the gender parity index, and this is weighted at 90% and 10%, and that's the way. Okay, Hazel is actually much better at explaining this than I am, but that's not the main part of my talk. My main part of the talk is about using it in impact evaluations. So what happened after WEAI was launched? It sort of took off like wildfire, and a lot of people and institutions who were adopting WEAI were agricultural development projects who wanted to use it for impact assessment. But it didn't really have the stuff that they were looking for. So they wanted to know, for example, did these projects, change relationships within the household? These projects create backlash in terms of intimate partner violence? Were women constrained in terms of their mobility and therefore unable to participate in project activities? And so these were things that projects thought about that they wanted to have information on. And so the other thing so they went on, adapted their projects, and if you're doing a portfolio comparison, it then becomes very difficult if projects are using very different indicators. So we got a grant from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation with support from USAID to develop a project level women's empowerment and agriculture index, or pro-WEAI. And this was done under the GAP2 project, which is a gender, agriculture, and assets project phase 2. And so these are a small proportion of the people who were part of the enterprise, because it just grew over the years. Oops. And okay, and these are our partners, our 13 partners, partner projects, plus others who worked with us to develop the metric. And Hazel is the lead author of this metric, so that's her baby. And the interesting thing is that in the process of developing the portfolio, we accidentally, serendipitously came up with a reach benefit, empower, and transform framework. And the reason is that when projects applied to join the portfolio, they had to be women's empowerment projects. So they had to say, okay, why are you interested in having your project evaluated? What strategies are actually, what, you have to be a women's empowerment project, and what strategies are you implementing? The funny thing is, as we looked at their proposals, we found out that not all of them actually had strategies that work towards women's empowerment. Many of them only had strategies to include women in program activities, ensuring men and women have the same access. Some of them had activities which are targeted towards benefiting women, increasing their well-being, food security, economic empowerment, and health. So this is more than reaching women. No? So kailangan women value the intervention. It's important to them. Direct benefits accrue to women. Their needs and preferences and constraints are taken into account in design and implementation. But it doesn't really get at empowerment, which is strengthening ability to make choices and to act on them. And so projects that actually provide opportunities for women to empower themselves, increase their agency, they attempt to change gender attitudes among participants, and if done at scale, could be transformative. So our colleagues in World Fish and also in our continuing work, we began to say, maybe it's not enough just to change individuals' attitudes. If you're going to change gender norms, this has to happen on a larger scale. It has to be transformative. So we looked at the transform objective, which goes beyond the woman to change gender norms and structures on a larger scale. And this is more challenging. It involves men. It means changing gender norms at the community and the societal levels, not just within the household, and addressing structural and institutional barriers and mobilizing the power of the collective. Okay. And the actors involved are different. In the reach, you can maybe just look at the project. In benefit, you look at project beneficiaries, our supporting actors. Empowerment means empowering women, involving, of course, men and authorities. But when you transform, you are really going way beyond. You're going sort of from micro to macro, and staying up there. Okay, and I want to always point out that we don't empower women. Women empower themselves. Men empower themselves. I think it's a goal for everybody to be empowered. It's important for people to have agency. Okay. So in the GAP2 projects, we found out had a whole range of strategies, and I'm not going to go through all of them, but the main ones are providing goods and services, strengthening organizations, building knowledge and skills, influencing gender norms, and transforming structures. The projects that were included in the portfolio were mostly from South Asia and sub-Saharan Africa. This is a function of the donors that funded the projects and were willing to support them being part of the portfolio. They had nutrition and income and nutrition objectives, and they worked through crops, livestock, and a combination of crops and livestock. I'm not going to have time to go into each of these projects in detail because I'm going to be providing a portfolio view. But there are papers on each of these projects on our website, and many of them are already published, and they are all open access. Okay, so GAP2 for pro-WEAI ended up developing another survey-based index based on interviews of women in the same household, and it's more theoretically grounded compared to the original WEAI. It's grounded in the theories of agency, where we have 3 domains: power within, or intrinsic agency; power to, or instrumental agency; and power with and collective agency. So this is the pilot pro-WEAI, which had 12 indicators. And what's also good to note is that pro-WEAI was developed using qualitative and quantitative methods. There is a suite of qualitative protocols which are available. Everything is on our website. And I'll show you the resource page in a bit. And very similar to Mama WEAI, pro-WEAI has 3 domains of empowerment, 90%, and gender parity index, 10%. What I'll point out also is that the indicators in pro-WEAI are equally weighted. I didn't go into it in the WEAI discussion, but the WEAI ended up having different weights for each of the for the sub-indicators, and that ended up being a little bit too difficult to communicate, I think, right? This one is simpler to understand and therefore easier to communicate. Okay. So what do we do in the portfolio approach to impact evaluation? And how much time do I have, by the way? How much more time do I have? 10 minutes? Okay. So 13 agricultural development projects. The projects piloted pro-WEAI and refined it using qualitative work. We implemented it at Endline. One of the projects was a project called, was part of the joint program for rural women's economic empowerment. It was part of GAP2. And the joint program eventually asked us to work on synthesis of 3 additional projects in Niger, Nepal, and Kyrgyzstan. And so we made efforts to harmonize indicators across both portfolios, and the same cutoffs were used. So the JPROE implemented sort of like different variations of pro-WEAI, but of WEAI, but the common element there was AWEAI, the abbreviated WEAI. So we basically used AWEAI, but with a stricter cutoffs from pro-WEAI, and I can talk about this more later. So the outcome variables included the component indicators, those little parts of the slice, and the overall empowerment measures, which were whether the individual is empowered, the empowerment score, and whether the household achieved gender parity. Okay, so very briefly, JPROE was like, that's the second paper. It's actually quite a large program. In the first phase, had about $28 million, and phase 2, which is ongoing, is $30.1 million. And 4 countries were included in the synthesis study. And these were the 4 countries. The objectives were food and nutrition security, increased income and livelihood, enhanced leadership and participation, and a gender-responsive policy environment. I think the key thing to note in JPROE is that it was a lot more women-focused than the GAP2 portfolio. Women's groups were the platform used for service delivery. And in 2 of the countries, Nepal and Kyrgyzstan, they implemented the Gender Action Learning System, which is an IFPRI methodology for getting all members of the household to sort of sit together and discuss their objectives. So it takes the views of men, women, children, older people into account. Okay. So let's now take a look at the portfolio results. So each project estimated the impact of the intervention or the treatment on outcome indicators using the pro-WEAI continuous and composite indicators. Because the outcomes variables have different units of measure, to be able to compare them, we use standardized effect sizes, which is basically the impact estimate divided by the standard deviation. So to illustrate, the workload indicator, for example, is hours worked. You can't really compare that with the number of credit decisions made, so you have to standardize. We assess the distribution of effect sizes, and we use the qualitative work and theory exchange to interpret the results. Okay. So I'm not going to go through these individually, obviously. This is not an eye exam. But what you'll see is that in the South Asia projects, you have more stars. I know we don't love stars stars are not the best measure of whether it's meaningful or not, but it's a convenient way. You have more stars in the South Asia projects, less so in the Africa project. But the point here is that we're actually able to observe more positive and significant impacts in the South Asia project than in the African project. The African projects have a lot more dispersion, but the thing is, they're actually pretty, I mean, no, I can't move it. That line there is a 0 line. They're really clustered around 0. It's like, you know, if you're if you're expecting like massive impacts on empowerment, you're not finding them, and it gets worse. Okay, if we look at the men's empowerment indicators, you have even fewer significant impacts on the South Asia side or in general, and for JPROE, however, they have only 6 indicators. You're seeing more impacts on women than on men, and more significant impacts. And I think the takeaway here is that for GAP2, most of the impacts are clustered around 0. More significant impacts are detected on women's indicators because they're the target of most GAP2 programming. JPRW had larger positive impacts across indicators, except for men who lost access to credit in Ethiopia. So this was a credit program where some households lost access to credit because they didn't pay. And let's take a look at a closer look at the portfolios. So the predominant color in this set of graphs is green. These are null results. And so the blue bars are negative. The green shade is null, and the orange are positive. And these are the indicators, right? So ranging from autonomy and income, self-efficacy, attitudes towards IPV, respect in household, livelihood decisions, asset ownership, decision on credit, workload, income control, visiting important places, group membership, and influential groups. JPROE has a smaller set of indicators. The workload indicator is reverse coded. So if a positive result is actually bad, it increases workload. And what you'll notice here is that, taking into account the smaller sample size of JPROE is only 4, in terms of proportions, JPROE has a larger proportion of significant and positive impacts. It does not seem to have any negative impacts on women's continuous indicators, which we do observe in the GAP2 projects. But the GAP2 projects really have a lot of null results. You'll notice that the group membership indicator in JPROE is like all orange, all positive, and that's not surprising because it was a group-based platform. So it's in effect, it's like an artificial result. But if it actually ended up being negative, then you would be very concerned. Okay, for men, they have more null results and a greater proportion of null results. And that's partly because JPROE programming and GAP2 programming was directed to women. So we don't really expect that much impact on men. But it's important to take into account the negative results because they indicate a potential for backlash. Now, in terms of overall indicators, despite the smaller sample size, JPROE has a larger proportion of positive impacts on women's empowerment indicators. But both programs also report a large proportion of null results on men's empowerment and whether the household achieved gender parity. Okay, so gender parity is really more difficult to achieve. And we have several insights on qualitative work. The qualitative work confirms some of the results that, for example, women did experience positive impacts, but they were not captured by the quantitative indicator. And it indicates that, maybe the quantitative indicator is a blunt instrument. There are difficulties in measuring collective agency. I think I'm going to highlight that if you end up having inconsistent results between your qual and quant, it's important to pay attention to them because don't bother saying, no, you're right. Mali yung study mo. Yun. No, assuming the studies were both well done and they were hopefully well resourced, you should take the results of both studies and assess them. Because, for example, in Nepal, the qual studies showed that women were more disempowered, even though the quant study showed they spent the same amount of time. But the daughters-in-law in Nepal were more disempowered because they had no choice, really. They had no agency about their time use. They had to follow their mother-in-law. Okay, so can agricultural development projects empower women? Now, the sad news is that even with empowerment objectives, many of them don't achieve significant impacts on empowerment indicators within the time frame of the evaluations. It's possible there could be long-term effects. You do have to come back. There are quite big differences between the South Asia and the Africa projects, partly because the projects were so different, but also because underlying gender norms are different. Okay, I'm going to borrow 2 minutes from you. We need to pay attention to workload. We expected the program would increase women's reproductive work, but there were also offsetting impacts. So who within the household, absorbs this? But some projects are successful, and this is going to be almost my last slide. So these successful projects are intentional. They try to address underlying gender norms. They often work through women's groups. They involve men and influential household and community members. And this is definitely my last slide. Since this is a research institute, what are the things that you might want to take away as you plan your research program? One is that if you're planning to do research on empowerment and transformation, this is a lot more difficult to measure. It's also more difficult to implement if you're a project. So intentional strategies are very important. You need to consider interactions and interconnections between resources, agency achievements. I would really encourage you to use empowerment measures as a part of M&E and future design work. In baselines, to diagnose what the issue is, to help to guide and inform new interventions, and also to use both qualitative and quantitative work to inform each other. And here are the resources. These are all open access. And if you have questions, you can go to the WEAI Resource Center. We have an email address. You can write to us if you have questions. We will try to get back to you as soon as we can. And there are also free online courses. Maraming salamat po.
Thank you, Dr. Agnes. Now we go to our second presentation, titled Measuring Women's Empowerment in National Surveys. So our next presentation will feature the third study, Measuring Women's Empowerment in National Surveys, Development of the Women's Empowerment Metric for National Statistical Systems. This study introduced the Women's Empowerment Metric for National Statistical Systems, which evaluates empowerment across 4 key areas: inner strength, practical capabilities, collective influence, and resources for empowerment. The authors detail the development process, its distinctive features, the pilot testing conducted in Bangladesh, Guatemala, Malawi, and Nepal, and the initial data analysis. The study will be presented by Dr. Hazel Malapit. Let me introduce Dr. Hazel. Dr. Hazel is a senior research coordinator in the Poverty, Gender, and Inclusion Unit in Washington, D.C. of IFPRI. She coordinates research, training, and technical assistance for the Women's Empowerment in Agriculture Index, or WEAI, and conducts research on gender empowerment, agriculture, health, and nutrition. She is co-principal investigator for the Gender, Agriculture, and Assets Program, or GAAP, Phase 2, and leads WEAI tool implementation. She also collaborates with agricultural projects and partners on women's empowerment metrics. Previously, she led the Gender Equity and Empowerment Unit at CGR. She holds a PhD in economics from the American University and a master's from the University of the Philippines. Thank you for joining us today, Dr. Hazel. You now have the floor.
Thank you so much. Maraming salamat. Yes, thanks. This is one of the few events where my last name is actually pronounced correctly, and for that, I am very grateful. I'm sure my dad will be very happy to hear that. It's always nice to be back in the Philippines, in Manila, in QC, my hometown. And I'm very, very happy to share with you a brand new tool we just launched called Women's. So this is an acronym that stands for the Women's Empowerment Metric for National Statistical Systems. We pronounce it Women's. We think it's fitting because it is a measure of women's empowerment. Unlike the WEAI, which is quite hard to pronounce, there are many pronunciations, WEAI, WEAI sometimes for French speakers. From Agnes, you heard this morning, just now, about how our suite of tools on the WEAI has been used for project settings. And you may be asking, why do we need a new tool? The WEAI has already been widely adopted, and it's been around for a dozen years now, 12 years. Do we need another metric for empowerment? Now, the answer is that, yes, we do. Wait, okay, let me try, wrong direction. Oh, sorry. Yes, we do. Because so far, the data we presented are project samples. And if we want to answer the question we had in the poll, are women empowered in the Philippines, or if you're trying to ask this nationally, what we need is national data, ideally, right, to be able to answer that question. And unfortunately, we do not have nationally representative data, except for Bangladesh. Bangladesh is the only country that has collected WEAI data in rural samples nationally. So this is still quite a big data gap. However, those of us, we are in PIDS today, we're all interested in development, which means that we care about our sustainable development goals. And of course, goal 5 is women's empowerment and gender equality. We care about it intrinsically as an important goal on its own, as we know. But we also know that research has shown that women's empowerment and gender equality are also critical in achieving other sustainable development goals. So if we don't pay attention to gender and women's empowerment, we may not achieve other goals as well. So this makes performance monitoring for achieving SDG 5 really important. Now, Agnes didn't have time, had a lot of cover. She didn't have time to go into the nitty-gritty aspects of the methodology of the WEAI, but I wanted to point out that we borrow a lot from the poverty literature in developing these metrics. And in fact, the collaboration with Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiative was precisely to draw on the Alcar-Foster approach for the multidimensional poverty index. So the bones, if you like, of the metric draws a lot from that same methodology. And just as in the poverty measurement space, what we've learned is that metrics matter when they motivate people to pay attention to an important issue, in this case, disempowerment of specific populations, women and other vulnerable populations. When it helps us monitor progress, and we need to do that to be able to understand whether we're moving in the right direction in terms of sustainable development goals. And when it can shape policy, meaning can these metrics give us insight on how we can make our investments in policies and programs to achieve our goals. So that's what we're aiming for whenever we're developing a new metric, and especially when we're aiming to measure a very complex concept such as empowerment. So I started with, do we need a new tool? And as I said, right now, since the WEAI was originally launched, we now have 256 organizations using some version of the WEAI in 62 countries. So this has been a widely adopted tool. However, it does have some limitations. So one is that it has a focus on agriculture, as the name suggests. It's a Women's Empowerment in Agriculture Index. So it focuses on rural livelihoods. Although we do capture non-farm livelihoods as well, there is not as much depth. And when we're working in economies that are transforming, we know that women and men are both diversifying livelihoods, migrating, they may be moving out of agriculture into non-farm sectors. And if we only look at agriculture, we may think that they're disempowered in agriculture, when that may just be a reflection of their non-farm livelihoods not being adequately addressed. So that is one limitation when we want to use the WEAI for a at the national scale. The practical limitation, as you already heard, is that it's quite long. Whether you need for impact evaluations, you do need that detail because you're trying to understand pathways to impact. And to be able to understand those mechanisms, you need all those details. So longer survey is justified. But if you're trying to survey, a 1-hour interview per respondent, 2 respondents per household, this is not a practical tool, right? So, and that's part of the reason why only Bangladesh has been able to collect national level data. So we wanted a tool that's more streamlined. And again, as I mentioned, we still need a tool that's suitable for SDG monitoring. And so here we try to do a better job of aligning the instrument to SDG 5, but also other SDGs that have gender dimensions. So we already talked about how this is actually a collaborative effort with a big range of partners. So the list of co-authors is huge, and we really appreciate, we were so happy to see that slide with all the names and even the little icon for our collective study team, because we want to reflect everybody's contributions to this index. As I mentioned, this is really intended for national surveys and multi-topic household surveys. So these are our partners. So the women's tool really benefited from all the lessons learned from the development of the WEAI, the AWEAI, the pro-WEAI, and I should mention, we also have add-ons for market inclusion, which was piloted in the Philippines, by the way. We have a paper on that we can talk about later. We have add-ons on nutrition, we have add-ons on livestock. So there are a range of instruments, so it's a suite of tools that we've developed. And over time, we've learned the best practices for developing these tools, and the women's process, I think, benefited from all the lessons we learned from that process. So we started out with stakeholder consultations back in, I think, 2020, if I'm not mistaken. We looked at existing questionnaires. We didn't want to reinvent the wheel. If there were existing questions that worked, we wanted to draw on those and test those. So we reviewed existing instruments, drafted a draft workshop, and then consulted with our stakeholders before we piloted them. So we selected our initial pilot countries, Bangladesh, Malawi, Nepal. These were the countries based on consultations, these were selected. The other important thing about selecting countries is we wanted to test our questions on a range of contexts. So we needed at least one from every region. But also we also needed contexts where we had strong partners who can do field work and are very well experienced in measuring empowerment. So once we had a draft, we did cognitive interviews. So cognitive interviews, this is not a measure of mental ability, just to be clear. This is a qualitative technique that we use to test whether questions are being understood by respondents as intended. So it tests for a range of biases: recall, translation, the phrasing of certain questions. So do they understand? Can they respond in the way that we're expecting? So we did cognitive interviews on our questionnaires, and then we piloted them. We got caught up in COVID. So instead of going straight to the face-to-face fieldwork, we started with 2 rounds of phone surveys in Bangladesh, Malawi, and Nepal. This turned out to be a blessing in disguise, because it turns out that this tool is also validated for phone surveys. So not just face-to-face, but we started with phone surveys. Later on, we added Guatemala, so we could put in a Latin America example there as well. And in Guatemala, we actually did our field work in 2 indigenous languages, Quiche and Quechua, along with Spanish. And then in between these rounds, we did psychometric analysis to improve the questionnaire. So in every round, we take our lessons learned, we revise it, and then we come up with another tool that we then test. So then we moved to face-to-face surveys in the 4 countries. And once we had all of that, additional psychometric validation, index construction, and that's how we get to a tool. So creating an index is a lot of work. And it takes a lot of time, obviously, a lot of consultations, a lot of testing. And so it's not an easy thing to do. Sometimes students come and say, oh, I want to make a new index. I'm like, okay, how much time do you have? How much resources do you have? Okay, so a lot went into the process. The questionnaire, surprisingly, is actually quite short, because that was our goal. So we were really aiming for an estimated interview time of 15 minutes, because that was what our NSO said was feasible at a national scale. So our questionnaire, our survey module covers 8 topics. So paid and unpaid activities, participation in leadership, life transitions and awareness of rights, financial services and credit, property ownership, decision-making, information and communication technology, and sexual harassment. And so these are sets of questions that then are combined to construct indicators. So the indicators are listed there in the middle column. And the parentheses, the numbers in the parentheses, just to give you an idea of how long these sections are, those are the number of items that are required to construct each indicator. So as I mentioned, we looked at the SDGs and said, okay, what are the SDG indicators targets, and are there gender dimensions in those targets? Can we map certain questions to those SDGs. So to the extent that we could, we did that. And so this mapping you see on the right-hand column reflects, which SDG indicator maps to which indicator. So that's our questionnaire. So I'll also point you to the stars. So there are some indicators that we only require for women, especially around women's rights and freedoms. So because those apply only to women, the women's interview takes about 15 minutes. For men, it's a little shorter. So men have less questions to answer. Okay. When we're constructing indicators and the index overall, we're drawing on a range of methodological approaches. So all these little circles you see here. And we're really trying to balance three goals. We're looking for a metric that is relevant to countries, because otherwise, if it's not relevant, then they will not use it, right? So it needs to be the country-specific relevance needs to be there. That's very important. We also are aiming for a tool that can be comparable, because this is you saw from Agnes's presentation, the value of synthesizing across a portfolio. So we also want to be able to compare within countries, so subnationally, within subpopulations within countries. We want to be able to compare across countries, so regionally, globally, and we also want to track progress. So we need to be able to compare over time. And then, of course, it needs to be valid. Is the tool, is the metric measuring what we are intending to measure around empowerment? And so to be able to balance these three goals, we're really looking to our field teams, their inputs on what's working, what's not working in the field. So their input is very important. We consulted with experts. One of them is in the room. Our discussant is one of those experts we consulted, as well as our NSOs and our partners on the ground. And then we did cognitive interviewing, as I mentioned earlier, to test whether the questionnaires are working, or the questions are working as intended. Different kinds of analyses like psychometric analyses, quantitative analyses, sensitivity analysis to look at different cutoffs, etc. And then all of these are, of course, need to be grounded by theory, but by empowerment theory, as Agnes discussed. So we're putting all of these pieces together, and sometimes they don't move in the right direction, right? Sometimes there are conflicting acts. So it's always a balancing act about how we get to the end result. But we're putting all these methodological approaches together. So as we heard from our moderator, the tool is measuring 4 domains, and you'll hear echoes of the WEAI here because we're really drawing from that same theory. So we have power 2, or instrumental agency. I'm starting here from the bottom left, which is really the ability to make household decisions. This is the most common measures of agency. So many surveys already collect some version of household decision-making, for example. That's instrumental agency. One of the lessons we learned from our GAP 2 synthesis is that it's not just workload, it's not just the amount of time you're spending on different activities, but control over that time that's important. So that's a missing aspect in the WEAI that we've added on to women. So this is one new component that we've included. So power 2 is really power to do things, power to act, power to make decisions. Intrinsic agency is power within, so that personal sense of power within yourself. And this really requires critical consciousness and awareness of inequalities. Critical reflection allows individuals to become aware of their own ability to make choices to change their lives. So this is another very important component. Collective agency goes beyond the individual, right? So this is a component that goes beyond the individual and beyond the household. So more and more, we're seeing a lot of programs that are investing in group-based development approaches, and the evidence is showing that this is actually quite an effective platform. So this is another really important concept to include. Now, the big difference between women's and the WEAI tools, the WEAI suite of tools, is the section on resources, because as Agnes talked about, WEAI only measures agency. That was the main focus. But here, because we are measuring empowerment at the national scale, we recognize that there are many contexts where resources, data on resources, sex disaggregated data, is really lacking. So there's a lot of demand for measuring this, but also that the lack of these agency enabling resources can be an important barrier to empowerment. So we include that. So this is the list of the indicators. So you can just read the slide. I'm not gonna mention them all, but just to say that what we do is we for simplicity's sake, every domain is weighted equally. And in every domain, we have 3 indicators. So overall, we have 12 indicators, and we weight everything equally, just for simplicity. So we find that this is the easiest way to communicate this index. So how do we measure it? So as I mentioned, some indicators apply only for women. So when we ask about women's freedoms, this is really a measure of women's own empowerment. When we ask men about their perceptions of women's freedoms, that can be quite important actually in analysis, but we don't include it in the index because it's not a measure of men's own empowerment. So in our pilot testing, we did ask men this question, but we don't include it in the construction of the index. So we have 12 indicators for women, equally weighted. We have 9 indicators for men on the right side, equally weighted, right? And we use a dual cutoff methodology. So really what we do is that depending on a person's response, we classify them as either constrained or unconstrained for each indicator. We have indicator-specific cutoff. So that's the first cutoff. We take the weighted sum, so you get a score, right, based on these weights. And then we apply a second cutoff to identify whether the person is empowered or disempowered. For now, we have a cutoff of 2/3 here. This is still subject to analysis because we're now collecting nationally representative data. And once we have more data at the national level, we're going to review whether this cutoff will be the one we adopt in the final version. So let's go to results. And I should mention, again, these are pilot sample sizes, right? So this is just illustrative of the kind of insights you can get in using women's. It is not nationally representative yet. Just like in a poverty metric, it gives you incidence and it gives you a measure of depth. So, you know, we have a poverty head count, for example, that measures incidence. We have a poverty gap that measures intensity of poverty, right? So same thing here. We can show the incidence of disempowerment. So here we see 88.6% of women in Bangladesh are disempowered compared to 59.7% of men. And then the intensity of the disempowerment of those women. So disempowered women are constrained on average in 54% of the weighted indicators compared with 47% for men. So not surprisingly, women are less empowered than men in the pilot samples. This is another way to look at this data. So the statistics I just mentioned are in this box. And when you multiply incidence with intensity, H times A, you get the disempowerment index, right? So all things considered, there are many economists in the room, ceteris paribus, same level of incidence. If intensity goes up, the disempowerment index goes up. Given the same level of intensity, if incidence goes up, the disempowerment index goes up, right? So this is a good feature of an index, that it increases with either incidence or intensity. Women's, of course, is a measure of empowerment, not disempowerment. And so to get the final women's score, we just flip it. We take 1 minus disempowerment, that gives us the women's score. So women's, you interpret that higher is better, right? So we always want that to be higher. Okay. So an important feature of the tool, both you saw it in Agnes's presentation, but because we're using the Alkire-Foster methodology, is decomposability. And so here we have the disempowerment index in the bar. So it's going down because it's bad. Like the longer the bar, the worse the situation is, right? So the more disempowered you are. So across the board, women always have longer bars. They're always more disempowered than men. But the interesting thing is that the different components within that are the size of the boxes. So visually, you can easily see where the constraints are and how they're distributed. And sometimes in some contexts, the patterns are the same. And that's important for programming. So if women and men have the same constraints, you incorporate that in the way you design your programs. But if they're different, that also requires a different kind of investment, right? So here we're able to rank, you know, what are the top constraints? And we could look across a portfolio as well, comparing women and men, different subsamples. You can also disaggregate subnationally, as I mentioned, or in according to different other correct. Okay. So yes, I know, I feel like I'm in the Oscars. Okay, I'm wrapping up. This is my last slide. So as I mentioned, as you can see, so that's just a little taste of what you can get when you use Women's, right? So as I mentioned, it's a very short tool, 15 minutes. I think it's very easy to justify that you have 15 minutes in your survey to add this tool. It allows you to make many comparisons, and we are really looking forward to the current uptake. It's currently being collected in Liberia, Sierra Leone, Tanzania. The Tanzania Ministry of Agriculture has a big ag project funded by the World Bank that is also adopting Women's. We have Honduras and an India example as well, and we're hoping that the Philippines could be part of this list. So maraming salamat po. Thank you so much. And for more information, please visit these links and write our email, and we're happy to assist. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hazel. And thanks to our presenters for those very interesting work that you've been doing. We'll have more time to discuss those during our open forum. So again, let me remind our online participants, you have the Q&A box for Zoom participants to post their questions and queries. For our Facebook Live participants, you have the comments section. All right, so moving on, let's enrich our conversation by inviting our esteemed discussants to share their comments and insights on the studies presented. Allow me the honor to introduce our first discussant, Dr. Celia Reyes, who is joining us via Zoom. So Dr. Reyes served as president of the Philippine Institute for Development Studies from 2018 to 2021. She is the first female president of PIDS. As a researcher, she is an expert in poverty research and has produced numerous studies on poverty and inequality, social protection, and development impacts of government programs. She also served as president of the Philippine Economic Society in 2011 and chairperson of the Interagency Committee on Poverty Statistics, convened by the Philippine Statistics Authority. She has been an advisor to various national government technical working groups on poverty monitoring and indicator systems in the country since the early 1990s. She developed the community-based monitoring system, or CBMS, a local monitoring system adopted by our LGUs and which has been institutionalized in the Philippines with the passing of RA 11315. Dr. Reyes holds a bachelor's and master's degree in economics from the University of the Philippines and a Doctor of Philosophy in Economics from the University of Pennsylvania. Ladies and gentlemen, let us welcome Dr. Celia Reyes.
Good morning, Dr. Domingo. Good morning, everyone. So I'm very happy to participate in the webinar today. First, I'd like to congratulate Dr. Quisumbing, Dr. Malapit, and the rest of their team for undertaking this valuable work on operationalizing a measure of women empowerment and applying it to assess the impact of projects on women empowerment. More specifically, pro-WEAI, or Project Level Women's Empowerment in Agriculture Index, has been developed as a combination of quantitative and qualitative approaches to assess women's empowerment in agriculture development projects, to diagnose key areas of women's and men's disempowerment, design appropriate strategies, and monitor project outcomes related to women's empowerment. I'm happy to see the number of studies that have been conducted using Women Empowerment in Agriculture Index, WEAI, in different countries, and how it has evolved into several variants. I became acquainted with this, I think, 2017, 2018. We often see and hear about the term women empowerment, but not as often do we see measures of how empowered women are. Even with the Sustainable Development Goals, where Goal 5 aims to achieve gender equality and empower all girls and women, there's no adequate measure of empowerment. For instance, Target 5.5 aims to ensure women's full and effective participation and equal opportunities for leadership at all levels of decision-making in political, economic, and public life. Yet, the indicators for this do not include a measure of how empowered men and women are, even for specific sectors such as agriculture. The SDG indicators for this are mainly in the political, public life, or business, and these are proportion of seats held by women in national parliaments and local governments, and proportion of women in managerial positions. Thus, efforts to come up with a measure of women empowerment, such as the WEAI and its variants, are very valuable. The two papers presented by Dr. Quisumbing highlight the usefulness of adopting the REACH, Benefit, Empower, and Transform framework in evaluating programs. It's important to distinguish between the REACH, Benefit, Empower, and Transform components of projects. While many projects say they aim to empower women, they really focus on the reach and benefit aspects, both in terms of providing interventions as well as in monitoring the impacts of the project. As it's been explained by Dr. Quisumbing, reach pertains to how many women participated in the project. Benefit pertains to how many women benefited from the project in terms of well-being outcomes, including income, health, and nutrition. Empower pertains to how many women participated in decision-making, and transform pertains to change in constraining gender norms, attitudes, and behaviors towards those that support gender equality. Many projects tend to focus on providing interventions to increase the reach or benefits of the programs to women, but not all would provide interventions to capacitate women or make the environment conducive for women to make strategic choices and act on them. Moreover, being able to measure and monitor the impacts of the project on these 4 dimensions would enable program designers to be more strategic in what they want to achieve. Since there are now metrics to measure distinctly if women are being reached, benefited, and empowered, I hope that program implementers would pay more attention to the distinction between these different dimensions and incorporate this in the design of intervention. So hopefully we'll see more of projects that have interventions directed at empowering men and women. Let me turn to the impact evaluation component of the papers. One of the challenges of evaluating the impacts of a program or project is that some of the impacts may take some time to be observed. In fact, Dr. Quisumbing noted that many agricultural projects did not achieve significant impacts on empowerment indicators within the time frame of the evaluation. Many of the monitoring and evaluation systems for projects are coterminous with the project or done once after the end of the project. I think that is what is referred to in the papers as endline. This method may not capture the longer-term impacts of projects, thus being able to come up with a measure of empowerment that can be easily integrated in a local community-based monitoring system that has been institutionalized and is done regularly and not project-based would greatly improve the chances of capturing the longer-term impacts on empowerment and transformation. As has been noted by the authors, there are some challenges in using the WEAI and pro-WEAI tools. Although there have been efforts as presented by Dr. Malapit, still the tool consists of a set of questions to provide data on different domains and indicators, and the module may take some time to answer and therefore may be difficult to adapt in national surveys, and especially in community-based monitoring systems where the intent is to have a short questionnaire that can be easily administered. So I think continuing the efforts of the team to further shorten the questionnaire would go a long way in terms of it being integrated in standard surveys being conducted by either national statistical offices or local government units. Secondly, is that the adaptation of questionnaires to local agricultural contexts may pose some difficulties in comparability across different settings. As has been highlighted, it's very important to make sure that the questionnaires are adapted to local context to make it relevant, but at the same time may also pose some difficulties when comparing them across different countries or localities. On a more technical level, the thresholds, just like with the multidimensional poverty index, there are certain assumptions or assumptions or decisions made regarding weights and cutoffs. So I think this is something that you always have to contend with when developing a composite index. These are just some of the challenges of using a comprehensive tool such as the pro-WEAI. So we have to balance wanting to take into account so many dimensions, but at the same time, the length of questionnaire, the weights to assign, and so forth. In terms of future uses of WEAI, I think related to the paper of Dr. Malapit is the need of an indicator on women empowerment and gender equality for SDG monitoring, particularly of Goal 5. So there's a need for an indicator of women empowerment that goes beyond the project level. So allow me to share that ADB is supporting an initiative to put in place a local SDG monitoring system. And as the international SDG advisor, I am identifying indicators that can track progress in achieving the SDG goals and targets using the CBMS approach. So the CBMS approach utilizes an IT-based tool that collects data from a census of households. If there is a shorter version of the WEAI tool that can be easily adopted, or the women tool that can be easily used at the local level and is comparable across countries, then it would be possible to include a measure for empowerment aside from what is currently being recommended. Moreover, if there's a variant of WEAI that goes beyond agriculture, that would be very useful. The challenge is that for regular monitoring, such as the CBMS, we need a tool that relies on a short set of questions. So my question is that based on your long experience working on this tool, is there a short list of questions covering specific domains for which data can easily be collected that can capture the level of empowerment of men and women? It need not be comprehensive at this point, but could signal there's significant disempowerment happening and could trigger and could be the signal to use a more detailed module to capture the details of this disempowerment. So moving forward, I hope that Dr. Quisumbing and her team will continue to work on measuring women empowerment and come up with a shorter version that can easily be integrated in local monitoring systems such as CBMS. I expect that there would be interlinkages among the different domains and indicators. Perhaps a smaller number of key indicators can be selected to flag disempowerment issues for incorporation in a survey instrument, and then a more complete module can be used to uncover the complexities of the disempowerment. And I think Dr. Malapit has shown earlier that in fact there have been efforts, they have actually been able to reduce the number of indicators to make it reach the 15-minute limit being imposed by or being suggested by national statistical offices. With a shorter module, I think it would be easier to incorporate in project monitoring and evaluation systems a measure of women empowerment and gender equality that can be part of the standard list of outcome and impact indicators for most projects that are intended to empower women. So at this point, I'll just share very briefly what we did several years ago to explore the use of some of the indicators, the WEAI indicators in one of our PIDS projects. In fact, one of the lead researchers in that project is Dr. Sunny Domingo. Fortunately, Adrian Agbon, a research associate then in the project, prepared a few slides to show what we did. The aim was really to explore the use of the approach, adapt it by adding areas where decisions are being made in agriculture in the Philippines with respect to climate adaptation and mitigation. So this was around 2018. It was not intended to assess the impact of an intervention, but more to understand the role of women in decisions related to climate risk adaptation and mitigation in agricultural activities. I think now that we can pursue fieldwork and primary data collection, this track of developing or measuring women empowerment in the field of disaster risk management can be pursued by PIDS. So let me just run through quickly some of the slides. Next, please. So this was an Asia funded project, Action Ready Climate Knowledge to Improve Disaster Risk Management for Smallholder Farmers in the Philippines, done with the support of ASHAR and done with in collaboration with UP Los Baños and Agricultural Training Institute and Pag-asa, of course, and some institutions in Australia. Next, and the aim, next slide, please. And the aim really was to improve the value of information flows between Pag-asa and key decision makers involved in managing climate and weather risk of smallholder farmers, particularly in the decision making with regards to some agricultural activities. Next. So, in the case of PIDS, we took charge of the study sites in Benguet, while our partner, in partnership with Benguet State University, while our other partners took care of the Leyte and Oriental Mindoro study sites. Next. So what we did was really to look at the WEAI questions at that time. There was no pro-WEAI still, I think, at that time, 2017, 2018. And we looked at the questions being used for WEAI. And what we did was to adapt, modified some of the questions, particularly in the role in household decision-making around production and income generation, and also in decision-making. Next. So we identified certain activities related to the use of weather and climate forecast, and had these questions which were related to women empowerment, and they were actually grouped in terms of household income generation, consumption, adaptation, and mitigation. Next. Next slide, please. And so we just, the way we tried to adapt the tool was we included set of activities that require decisions related to weather information, like making sure to check the weather updates, especially before planting, fertilizing, and harvesting of vegetables and other crops, and considering the weather forecast in farming activities like planting, weeding, fertilizing, harvesting, and considering the weather forecast also in transporting crops. Next. So what we actually learned is that it was the way it was very useful. The tool that has been developed has been very useful, and it was quite easy to adapt to local context, and also to adapt it to look at the issue of disaster risk management in the context of climate change. Next. So I won't go through, these are just some of the results, just to show that we can actually, as I said, apply the tool with some modifications. Next. In particular, look the use of weather and climate information. Next. So I won't show the numbers because they're not important at this time, but just really wanted to show that WEAI can be adopted, and I think that's what the team of Dr. Quisumbing, Dr. Malapit has done. They have several variants of WEAI now, and I hope that they would continue to work on this important research topic. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mamsel. Please stay online for the open forum. Now we move on to our second equally esteemed discussant, Dr. Jose Ramon Albert. Let me introduce Dr. Albert. Dr. Albert or Toots is a professional statistician and senior research fellow at PIDS. He earned a BS in Applied Math, summa cum laude, from De La Salle University, and his MS and PhD in statistics from the State University of New York at Stony Brook. From September 2012 to 2014, he led the National Statistical Coordination Board as its Secretary General before it was merged into the Philippine Statistics Authority. Dr. Albert has consulted for various Philippine government agencies, private firms, and international organizations. For over 2 decades, he has worked in 25 countries across different regions on poverty diagnostics, econometrics, and survey analysis. He has also taught at various higher education institutions in the Philippines and has written on education, poverty, social issues, and development. Dr. Toots, you may now take the floor.
Thank you very much, Sunny, for the kind words of introduction. Let me just say that, of course, I'm tasked to be a discussant for the interesting paper that was presented by Hazel on women's, partly, I think, because I was already, I did participate on when this was being developed. So as was mentioned, this tool was developed by Hazel, Agnes, and their colleagues and detailed in a recently released paper. I'm actually glad not on the sides, not just to give this discussion, but also because this is the very first time that Agnes and I are actually meeting face to face, where we've been friends for many years now on Facebook, partly because we have common friends, and then sort of there are things that gel. But when we talk about gender is not just about women; it's about women and men. But sometimes, unfortunately, that gets lost in the conversation. Anyways, how do I go this way? Okay. So my discussion will first give a summary of the paper covering the purpose, methodology, and key findings of this work, just to make sure I understood it. And then I delve into the relevance, methodological considerations, data analysis, and potential applications of the work. The women's was developed to address a very critical gap in our ability to measure women's empowerment consistently across different contexts. Let's look at 3 key aspects of its development. First, it addresses the need for a standardized measure of women's empowerment. Until now, we have lacked a tool that can be applied uniformly across various cultural and socioeconomic settings. Second, women's is a specifically designed for integration into large-scale multi-topic surveys done by national statistics offices, and this is crucial for its widespread adoption and for enabling comparisons across different populations and over time. Lastly, the development process was very rigorous and iterative. It involved expert interviews to identify priority areas, cognitive testing to ensure question clarity, and pilot studies to refine the tool. And this meticulous approach enhances the reliability and validity of the metric. Now, let us delve into the methodology itself. The metric is built around 4 key domains of empowerment. The domains capture a comprehensive view of empowerment from internal beliefs to external actions and resources. Women's includes 12 indicators for men, 9, not 8, 9 for men. The difference reflects some aspects of empowerment that are particularly relevant to women's experiences. The approach used is a counting-based multidimensional index. This means that for each indicator, individuals are classified as either constrained or unconstrained based on specific criteria. The overall empowerment score is then calculated from these binary indicators. The women's was piloted in 4 countries, Bangladesh, Malawi, Nepal, and Guatemala. And this diverse set of contexts allowed for testing the tool's applicability across different cultural and socioeconomic settings. A consistent finding across all 4 countries was that women were less empowered than men. And this aligns with our understanding of global gender inequalities, but provides a quantifiable measure of these disparities. Importantly, the study found variation in both empowerment levels and contributing factors across contexts. This highlights the importance of a tool that can capture nuances in empowerment across different settings. The women's make several important contributions to the field. First, it identifies a significant gap in existing empowerment measures. While we've had tools for measuring specific aspects of empowerment, women's provides a comprehensive standardized measure. A key strength is its applicability across both urban and rural areas and across various livelihoods. This broad applicability is crucial for capturing empowerment in diverse settings, and importantly, women's aligns closely with the SDGs, particularly SDG 5 on gender equality and women's empowerment. And this alignment enhances its relevance for policy and development work. Building on its relevance, women's offers several additional benefits. It enables cross-contextual comparisons, a significant advancement allowing us to compare empowerment levels across different countries or regions in a standardized way. The tool is decomposable, meaning we can break down the overall empowerment scores to see which factors are contributing most to this empowerment. This feature provides valuable insights for targeted policy interventions. Finally, women's has the potential to track progress on women's empowerment over time. This longitudinal capability is crucial for assessing the impact of policies and interventions aimed at improving gender equality. While beyond doubt, women's is relevant and provides a contribution, we should also consider how well women's captures critical areas on women's empowerment identified in the literature. In 2018, I was fortunate enough to have been part of working on an ADB UN Women benchmark publication on gender equality in the SDGs in Asia and the Pacific, with my dear friend and former colleague at the NSCB, Ms. Lina Castro, together with colleagues from Chris Conky and a huge expert team. This publication identified several critical areas that include sexual and reproductive health rights, recognition and redistribution of unpaid care work, and elimination of violence against women. While women's addresses some of these areas, like unpaid care work, it may need expansion to fully capture others, such as climate resilience and comprehensive measures of violence against women. Of course, you're capturing a little bit of the vow, but not quite fully because, you understand my point. Now let's turn to some methodological considerations. A major strength is its rigorous development process using cognitive interviewing, multiple rounds of testing that enhances the tool's validity and reliability. The counting-based approach used in women's has several advantages. It's relatively easy to communicate to policymakers and the public, and it provides clear, actionable insights for policy. However, there are challenges, particularly in setting appropriate empowerment cutoffs across diverse contexts. What constitutes empowerment may vary across cultures, making it very difficult to establish universal thresholds. There are also additional methodological points to consider. The selection of indicators involves balancing comprehensiveness with brevity. The current set of indicators aims to capture key aspects of empowerment while keeping the survey manageable. We must acknowledge some limitations. The reliance on self-reported measures may also introduce biases, and there's potential for cultural biases in how questions are interpreted or answered. Lastly, the use of different indicators from women and men, while allowing for gender-specific aspects of empowerment, does affect direct comparability between the sexes. As a former chief statistician of the country, I should also add that we should consider how women's indicators align with or complement existing gender-related indicators that countries are already collecting. This alignment could facilitate easier adoption and integration into existing data collection efforts. Unfortunately, sometimes even when statistical systems collect data, for instance, I work now a lot with Laos. Can you imagine? They have been collecting a lot of time use data, but no analysis. Yes, I will actually be coming up with the first report on their time use data that's been they're collected from their household they call it the LEX, the Low Expenditure Consumption Survey, but no analysis has been done. They also collect data on time use slightly in the labor force survey, but no analysis again. So this is the problem. So even if you throw this to the statistical systems, the issue is whether there will be a capacity within those systems. All right, so moving on to data and analysis. It's important to note that the pilot study used non-representative samples, except for in one case. While this was sufficient for initial testing, it limits the generalizability of the findings. A key strength is the decomposability of the women's score, which allows researchers to identify the primary contributors to this empowerment, providing insights for targeted interventions. However, questions still remain about cross-cultural validity and comparability. Further research is needed to ensure that women's is measuring the same constructs across different cultural contexts. Additional points on the data analysis. The study found low to moderate correlations among indicators. This suggests that the indicators are measuring different distinct constructs, which is a positive sign for the comprehensiveness of the tool. However, there were limited associations found with external variables such as well-being measures, and this raises questions about the construct validity also of women's in terms of its relationship to other very important outcomes. These findings underscore the need for further validation with more diverse representative samples. This will be crucial for establishing the robustness and generalizability of women's. And of course, let's consider the practical applications and potential institutionalization of women's. While there's significant potential for integrating women's into national surveys with the help of 50 by 20 initiative, to 50 by 2030 initiative. However, it's important to note that this would also require extra resources for either new surveys or adding questions to existing ones. And unfortunately, many NSOs and national statistical systems are already having difficulty finding funding for their regular surveys. So it may be important for IFPRI, World Bank, and others to work on advocacy materials for chief statisticians also of countries, and also for donors, for gender advocates. I mean, in Laos, for instance, you have all of this. I mean, we're working on an ADB project on gender equality, disability, and social inclusion to improve their production all the way until communication of statistics. But it's a tough thing to sell, partly because, as I said, the statistical systems are underfunded. So a key advantage, though, is the relatively brief administration time, 15 minutes. This makes it more feasible to include in larger surveys without significantly increasing respondent burden. But I assure you that even for surveys now, some countries, like, as I said, even Philippines, our FIES takes 3 to 5 hours to accomplish. Can you imagine? So now try to ask the PSA here, which is, I think they transferred already back to but they used to be 2 floors down, the floor down and the floor below. Anyways, there's really this issue about respondent burden. So however, challenges remain in standardizing women's across diverse cultural contexts. Ensuring comparability while respecting cultural differences will be an ongoing challenge. Further considerations for practical applications, women's can inform policy interventions through its decomposition analysis by identifying key contributors. It can help policymakers target their efforts more effectively. The tool offers an opportunity for longitudinal tracking of empowerment. This could be invaluable for assessing the impact of policies and interventions over time. However, successful implementation will require capacity development in national statistical offices, ensuring staff are trained to administer the women's correctly and interpret its findings. That's going to be crucial. And also, they may collect the data, but they don't analyze, that has happened already. So a significant challenge is really the current resource constraints faced by NSOs. Many are struggling to fund their regular surveys, making it difficult to advocate for new standalone survey for women's. To address this, I hope the authors and the World Bank and other funding agencies could explore ways to integrate the women's modules into existing national surveys rather than implementing it as a separate survey. Successful implementation will require capacity building and careful consideration how to integrate data collection without overburdening statistical systems. Many NSOs are already starting to work on data integration that puts together data from disparate databases, censuses, surveys, admin data, and big data to create new data sources that could potentially provide answers to policy questions. This is in recognition that new primary data collections are just too expensive. So to conclude, let us just consider the future directions. Further testing with nationally representative samples would be crucial to establish the women's validity and reliability across a broader range of contexts. Reliability of indicators and cutoffs based on wider implementation will be necessary as we gather more data. We may need to adjust the tool to ensure that it's capturing empowerment accurately across different contexts. Further amendments is refined, consider how it can be adapted to more comprehensively capture critical issues in women's empowerment, crucially climate resilience, and a broader sense of violence against women, ensuring its policy relevance. Despite the challenges, women's has the potential to significantly impact women's empowerment research and policy by providing a standardized, comprehensive measure of empowerment. It could revolutionize how we understand and address gender inequality globally. But strategies must also be developed for phased implementation that allows countries to gradually adopt women's based on their capacities and priorities rather than requiring full implementation all at once. This could include exploring possibilities for pilot integration with existing surveys to assess feasibility and resource requirements. Thank you again for the opportunity to give this discussion on a very interesting piece of work. Sorry.
Excellent comments, Dr. Toots. All right, we'll be hearing more from Dr. Albert during the open forum. May we request our presenters to please go to our front area for the panel discussion. So we are also requesting Mamsel to open her camera for the open forum. So before we ask the questions from our audience, may we request our presenters, Dr. Hazel and Dr. Agnes, to comment on the manifestations provided by our two esteemed discussants.
I actually want, before going to the discussion comments, I would actually like to request Miley or whoever to pull up the answer, well, an answer, not the answer, to one of the questions that you post in the opening slide, the opening session, which is, are women in the Philippines empowered in agriculture or not? Because actually, quite coincidentally, I think Hazel was here, maybe not at PIDS, but at UPSC, to conduct some work on women's empowerment and value chains in the Philippines. And Celia and Job were key collaborators in that effort. And I think the answers are going to be quite insightful in answering the question. So I think what's clear here is that although many of them, both men and women, were in the four, so just as a background, this is 4 agricultural value chains: abaca, coconut, seaweed, and swine. This was not nationally representative. There's quite a great variation in the extent of this empowerment. So there was actually, if you look at the percent of those who are empowered, it's actually quite low. It's like way under 50%, with some variations. But if you go to the next slide, I think the next slide is actually, I think, more interesting, was that when you look at the contributions of the indicators to this empowerment, the biggest contributions to this empowerment were respect among household members, respect within the household, and attitudes towards gender-based violence. This is very different from the cross-country results in from the Feed the Future initiative, where the biggest sources of disempowerment were access to and decision-making over credit, lack of group membership, and workload. So the profile in the Philippines is quite different. The least contribution to this empowerment for both men and women were access to credit, ownership of land and other assets, and input in livelihood decisions. So I think what this shows is that you really have to dig down into specific countries and contexts to diagnose this empowerment, because it's quite different. So I'm going now to Celia's wonderful comments, and thank you so much for these comments, Celia. We were actually madly taking pictures because I don't know whether you noticed us madly taking pictures as you were talking, because we are also doing some work developing a climate-related WEAI, and some of the questions, many of the questions that you put out are really relevant to our work. What I really like your example, or your suggestion about using community-based monitoring to track empowerment impacts of projects, because you did point out that a lot of M&E efforts are coterminous with the project. If communities took it on themselves to monitor impacts over time, that would be a more sustainable effort, I think, than just a project, because it would also be able to track spillover effects. The issue that you raised is that whether there is a shorter tool, and Hazel and I were conferring, there is the abbreviated WEAI, which is still a bit long, but there's also women's, which is 15 minutes. So I think this is quite exciting, and I'll pass this on to Hazel, because Hazel's actually managing the portfolio of adaptations of pro-WEAI and WEAI. So
Yes, thank you so much, Agnes. And thank you, Celia and Toots, for the wonderful comments. We would love copies of your presentations, please, after the event. Just to start, just to pick up on what Agnes was saying on the length of the tool, I think one caveat, right? The pro-WEAI has been widely used, and there are published papers, open access papers already available. So the analysis has been done. We don't have that evidence yet for women's, because it's a new tool, and this is why, as was mentioned, using that is actually quite critical. So we think it can be useful for impact evaluations. We have not tested it yet, and we would love for somebody, maybe somebody from PIDS, maybe other researchers out there, would be willing to take this on. I think that would be, building that evidence would be really critical. On the point about, well, there are many, you raised a lot of really important questions, but maybe just to touch on a few of those to clarify. On the violence against women aspect, we purposefully do not collect in actual experience of violence, either for any of the WEAI tools nor for the women's. And the reason is because of our concerns around capacity for ethical considerations. Whenever you collect data on actual incidents of violence, there is a responsibility to offer services. And because we are, we need a tool that low capacity settings can be able to adopt. We do not want to impose the need to be able to pass rigorous IRB. And of course, the bar is much higher for actual violence. So unfortunately, that's the practical reason, right? So we opted instead to collect attitudes around IPV for pro-WEAI in women's, because this is not just around rural settings. We cover urban settings and all kinds of livelihoods. Based on our consultations, etc., what we opted to collect was around sexual harassment. And so, but it's still around attitudes, right? To be able to, so it's just, we think it's a leading indicator towards actual experience of violence. It's not exactly that, but it still gives you some insight, right? So that's the first reason. The second reason is that there are also other tools and metrics for measuring those. So do we need a new indicator around violence against women? We think not necessarily. There are other tools already available. So anyone is actually welcome. If you have a project, for example, or you're in a setting where this is a big concern, you can certainly use women's or WEA, and alongside that, collect more detailed information on VOW. So as well as any other topics that's not there, right? So that's not you're always welcome to add on. Of course, that requires resources, and you may need to do some thinking about trade-offs. But what we always recommend is to combine the analysis of women's along with these other outcomes. So that's one strategy that you could try to do to build that up. But I'm not optimistic that it will be included. I think the attitudes is as far, even on that, there's some pushback. So so it's quite hard to expand even further. On the point on thresholds, just methodologically, the thresholds, any composite index, the weights and the thresholds is always a question. So this is obviously not a limitation unique to the women's tool or the WEA tools, but because it's a survey-based tool and you have all that raw data in the background, you can always do sensitivity analyses. So what we always recommend for users is that when you're trying to compare globally or regionally, you need to use standardized weights. But with that way, if you have more information that can guide you on which thresholds make more sense, you can reconstruct it and compute it for different alternative weighting schemes. And in fact, I think we might have another paper where we do these kinds of robustness tests, and that's actually good practice. That's something you should always do, I think, when you're using any composite index. In our validation, we did look at, so the 2/3 cutoff that I talked about, we did look at 60, 65, 70% cutoffs, and qualitatively those are somewhat similar, although we're not super confident at this stage because, like we said, these are pilot samples. They're not nationally representative. So we're waiting for the national data and revisit all these thresholds. So these are part of the refinements that we expect to be doing in the coming months. What else? Capacity and analysis. This is really, really critical. I'm so glad you brought that up. I think my main worry about women's is that analysis is quite underfunded. And the last thing we want is for people to be collecting data that's not used. It breaks my heart, that example on time use, where they're collecting all that data and not using it, because basically that's an investment you could have put in somewhere else, right? So we need to use these data, and actually using the data, even if the tool is imperfect, is really, really valuable for the global development community, because we're learning, how the WEA evolved. The reason it got better is because as people complained, those complaints were so helpful because it helped us refine the questions. So please help us refine this tool. It's our first attempt, right? This is the first version. It's very new. I think over time, I'm really looking forward to a better version that gives this balance of nuance, depth, breadth. We're balancing so many goals, and sometimes we can't do it all, especially when we already have very long surveys, as you said, that are quite long. So respondents' burden is always a problem. I want to end with the point about capacity also, but just to explain that in the 50 by 2030 initiative, the Sierra Leone, Liberia, Tanzania national surveys, the way they've been able, part of the reason why those NSOs were very interested to do this was that we packaged them together with the collection of the Women's Minimum Dietary Diversity Indicator. And I think that was a really important strategic it was a good strategy, because that's already, when you're collecting data on nutrition and women's own nutrition, you're already reaching the women. And so adding on another 15 minutes in a survey where you do want to make analysis on, you do want to analyze nutrition data along with empowerment data, that makes total sense. So I think it was not a stretch to convince those NSOs to do this. That said, they did need resources to add those on. And what they've done is do subsamples. So there is a National Agricultural Survey, a subsample of that will be piloting women's along with the minimum dietary diversity indicator. So this phased approach, I think, as you said, is the way to go. So I'll end there. There's so much more to discuss, but maybe we could talk more after the seminar.
All right. So thank you, Dr. Hazel, Dr. Agnes. We are now opening the floor for your questions. We'll be posting all the presentations online, so you can access and download the same materials anytime after this event. All right. Well, before I call on Dr. Briones, let me remind our online participants to please post your questions via the Q&A box in Zoom, as well as the comment section in Facebook. So first question coming from Dr. Briones.
Thanks, Dr. Sani. First of all, I concur with both panelists in affirming that this is indeed innovative and very valuable. Finally, we are able to measure. And we're often criticized, if we don't measure it, it doesn't matter, right? So now it's beginning to matter thanks to these measurements. So for the first presentation, Agnes, you mentioned a few times about backlash, concern about backlash. But I'm wondering to what extent that really matters, because if power is a zero-sum game, and to a large extent, I think it is, then naturally the empowerment of one group might mean the disempowerment of another group. And maybe we shouldn't really care about the aggrievement of that group. I mean, if the women got suffrage, well, let's celebrate that and ignore the aggrievement of the men, right? And yeah, if the minorities got civil rights, then let's celebrate that and ignore the aggrievement of the white people, right? So that's just one concern. The next presentation, Hazel, I'm very grateful indeed that you gave a very succinct explanation of the conceptual framework: intrinsic, instrumental, collective, and agency. My concern with the construction of this index, and maybe it betrays my lack of understanding and familiarity with these concepts, is the more classical concern, shall we say, about gender equality, like larger social structures. Like instead of my individual view of whether we reject sexual harassment of women, do I feel like the legal mechanisms will welcome any complaint? Will it run fairly in my favor? Do I have that perception? Will it operate fairly in my favor, fairly, as it were, if I raise a complaint, right, or if I express a grievance? Similarly, the wage setting. So there's this classical concern about gender disparity in compensation structure. In agriculture, by the way, going back to ACO's opening remarks, my chapter in the book, Outside Looking In, I actually checked the data, the PSA data, and actually controlling for task, women did get paid lower in agriculture. And for me, this is a puzzle. And it's not really like women get paid the lower paying, less strenuous tasks, meaning for the same task, they actually get paid less. And my suspicion is, but I cannot confirm this is mere speculation, there is a sexist strength discount. So women are perceived to be, slower at digging and manual labor, and therefore less productive on an 8-hour basis compared with men. But that is mere speculation. Anyway, so that talks to a larger social structure in wage setting. And I don't really see, or maybe there are some details that I could not see, that they try to, at least from the viewpoint of the men and women participating in that market, whether there is fundamental fairness in the setting of those market exchange rates.
All right. Thank you for that question. Before I ask you to answer, may I get another question from one of our participants here? Dr. Paqueo, please.
I was very pleased to hear this presentation. Yeah, it is really kind of innovative. And I think it probably has, shall we say, cross disciplinary or sectoral utility. So my question is whether this methodology could be applied to measuring empowerment and these various related aspects that you have defined for on issues of human development, whether it is in the context of agricultural communities or rural communities or urban communities. And when I say human development, specifically, for example, education, like in the Philippines, there's a big talk about decentralization of education, empowerment of schools, parents, etc. But I think the empirical grounding of that is still not very well developed, particularly in terms of measuring, sort of what dimensions of empowerment really do affect the ability of parents to build the human capabilities or competencies of their children. So I was wondering whether you could speak to that point of view.
Can one of our presenters answer? Dr. Agnes, please.
Sure. I'll take the backlash question, and I think that's a really good question. I guess the question is whether empowerment is a zero-sum game or not. It depends on whether you think it's a fixed pie or whether the pie can grow. So I like to think that in some instances, the pie can grow, that it is possible for both men and women to be empowered. And that you don't, in fact, this is one of the things that we're hoping for in many of our agricultural development projects, that empowerment of women does not come at the expense of men. So you will be amazed actually at how many people, like we're working with at the project level, are asking us, can you make this happen so that men are not disempowered too? Because otherwise they actually really do fear for backlash. And it's easy for us to talk about backlash when we're not living in the communities or in the same household, but backlash can actually mean increased intimate partner violence for many of these very vulnerable women. And what's good to know is that in some of the projects, there have been cases where women are becoming more empowered without disempowering men. And other cases, so the Bangladesh project where we randomize the treatment of agricultural extension, nutrition education, and gender sensitization training to husbands and wives together actually ended up empowering women without disempowering men. And in fact, ended up empowering men in some of the treatments, which included nutrition, because they had previously not received this type of education. And when they started learning about nutrition, they felt more empowered, which is, I think that's great. The other issue, though, is that sometimes the quantitative metric is a blunt instrument. So, for example, in the case of Nepal, we ended up seeing a reduction in the men's empowerment score, and that came a lot from men working more, so their workload increased. But when we did the qualitative work, when our collaborators did the qualitative work, they found out that the husbands actually liked doing more work because they were taking care of their kids. Before they weren't involved in their kids at all. Now they're helping with childcare. And so they're saying like, it may appear that we're disempowered, but we're actually happy being more involved in our family. So I think this is why it's important to have, both quant and qual, because you can't really get the full picture from that.
So thanks so much for the questions. On the question on women's being based on individual perception, I think it might be useful to go back to this reach, benefit, empower, transform framework, because the way we designed the instrument, these are of course individual surveys. And so we focus on perceptions because we think that regardless of what happens outside, if the person do not feel themselves empowered, so if they themselves do not perceive that they have control over something or that they have influence, then it doesn't matter what's happening outside, their actions are consistent with their own personal beliefs. So that's part of the reason why we focus. There's always an internal part to that. On the other hand, I think what you raised are some of these more institutional transformational constraints. And it's true that when you just look at an individual measure, it doesn't tell you necessarily about those higher levels. And so I would say that, there is, for example, the Women, Business and Law Index that the World Bank collects that tells you about the legal framework and how fair is that, let's say, to women, and whether those are actually implemented, how the legal structures are in place. And so I think combining, again, the women's, we tried our best to make it as broad as we can, but it still cannot cover, obviously, at all levels, because at the end of the day, it's a survey instrument. So to get to those higher levels, I think we need to analyze it along with those other types of information. I don't know if Agnes wants to say more about the labor market. So I think maybe I'll end it there. On the question around, is the methodology applicable to questions around human development and empowerment of schools, parents, etc. Sorry. Okay. I would think about it this way. Parents' goals for their kids, we could think of that as achievements, right? That's the outcome that they want to get at. And are they empowered to make decisions in a way that advances those goals, right? So the way we've designed the empowerment metrics is that these are the aspects of empowerment we think are core, are essential. And that's why we draw on theory. So you need some form of intrinsic agency, you need some form of instrumental agency, you need some sort of collective agency, you need some agency enabling resources. All of that put together helps you make those decisions for your kids, right? And so I would say, yes, that your personal sense of empowerment or that score tells you about the person's empowerment. And if the goal is better nutrition, if the goal is education, maybe the goal is, I want my kid to be a doctor or whatever it is, right? I think empowerment contributes to that. Now, where is the evidence? Do we have papers around this? Using women's? Not yet, right? Because we need to collect that data together. And so maybe this is also a segue to my call for, oh yeah, Agnes, okay, please.
But okay, we don't have it from women's because it's still new, but we do have evidence from WEAI that better empower women who are better, that women's empowerment is conducive to better human capital outcomes of their children. So yeah, we have written papers on this, but we have forgotten that we wrote them. It's Hazel's paper.
All right, thank you.
Yeah.
We have very limited time for the open forum, so I'll go to the next question. But before that, it seems that it's not that simple an equation. No, empowering one group doesn't mean disempowering another. And then again, you mentioned earlier that men and women actually empower themselves. So you have independence in terms of empowering groups. Interdependence and independence probably. Okay, the next set of questions will be addressed to our local researchers, Dr. Albert and Dr. Reyes. It's about the possible application of the methodologies presented to our local setting. Ms. Marian Debrea of UNDP has this related question. For example, a program or project was not originally designed to have God lens from the start, but eventually realizes the value of assessing its gendered impacts. How should we, as evaluators, go about addressing this? Can Dr. Reyes, Mamsel, answer first? Then I'll call on Dr. Toots. Mamsel?
Yeah, I think trying to. Okay. I think that could still be done. I mentioned about the possibility of actually including as part of the standard set of indicators a women empowerment metric. So I think even if it was not designed for that, you can always incorporate these additional indicators, and that would be very useful. Vic, Dr. Paqueo's favorite term, unintended consequences. So that could be, you know, some of the unintended consequence of a particular project. So it would be good to monitor this. As I mentioned earlier, I'm hoping that if we have developed a metric, a measure of women empowerment that is easier to collect, perhaps even shorter than 15 minutes, it could become part of our standard set of indicators. Thank you, Sani.
Dr. Toots?
Yeah, let me also second what Celia was pointing out, that really, well, for projects, for specific projects, just because you have your M&E tools set up per design doesn't mean you can change them. You can always refine your M&E tools. And in fact, this is another thing that I was thinking. It's not just even about gender empowerment particularly. That's important, but you know, you think of it more broadly in terms of social inclusion, because there are some not even just women, but even men, persons with disability, certain ethnic groups, and it's even going to be worse if you have those intersectionalities, and we are not able to see the gaps in empowerment or disempowerment of all of these different sets of people, because clearly some people are going to be more left behind than others. But if we're not measuring it, then to some extent doesn't matter for the projects. But it should matter, right? Because we keep talking about social inclusion, we keep talking about inclusivity and all that stuff, but how do we actually make sure that it's happening? And unless you have the tools around, not just for projects, but for specific things that are being regularly undertaken even by national government, you have all of this administrative data that you keep collecting, but at the end of the day, you're not even able to tell effective stories of what's happening. And that's what's sad, you know. I keep saying I've echoed this over and over, that you keep collecting data, but at the end of the day, it doesn't get transformed into information. We're just data rich and information poor, you know. And that's even more sad because nothing will happen.
Excellent responses. And it's also sad that we have very limited time for the Q&A. Maybe I'll ask those present here for one last question.
I'd like to concur yung mga sinabi po natin mga panauhin dito, yung mga resource person natin. Actually, when we talk about gender, women empowerment, talaga napaka-broad siya. Kasi tignan lang natin yung Beijing platform for action na may 12 thematic areas po siyang ibinanggit. Economics, poverty, even girl youth. So talaga napaka-broad po ng usapin na ito. However, let me remind everyone that gender and development doesn't only focus on empowering the women, but also kasi sa Pilipinas, meron tayong equality of women and men before the law. Yun yung pinaka-foundation po natin. And even in 1910, 10, RA 9710 or Magna Carta of Women, binanggit naman din doon na hindi lang ito explicitly for women, but rather pwede rin tignan yung mga concern ng mga kalalakihan. May provision po doon. May provision na po. I cannot just remember sa dami ng batas na kailangan kong alamin dahil nasa gender equality and social inclusion po kami. So medyo hindi ko na specific, but definitely I came across na hindi lang women concern but as well as yung concern din ng mga kalalakihan. In fact, the NEDA, which is the mother agency of PIDS, right? And the PCW, with the funding from the and all the Philippines, okay, for gender development, with the funding from the UNDP rather, and the ADB, came up with the harmonized gender development guidelines, the Hagadaga. So, yung kaninang tanong regarding to paano yung walang gender lens, pwede natin kasing i-consult si Hagadaga. May tools po ang PCW para makita natin yung gender lens neto. And then we do have also the gender mainstreaming framework, evaluation framework na rin po ng PCW, kinrap. Actually, meron silang soft copy nito. We could also make do with it para maano natin yung disparity para maiangat natin. However, let's not be let's focus too much na iangat masyado dahil equality nga yung nahabol natin. It's like sa leadership and governance, right? Nakakalungkot lang na may mga ahensya tayo na sinasabi, sige, angat namin 80-20. That's not equality anymore. However, we could put an indicator na kung saan yung mga recommendations, yung mga suggestions ng mga kababaihan ng part ng policy making, mai-account natin. Ito ang mga naging suggestion. Ito yung na-adapt natin. Siguro isa sa mga indicators, total indicators naman yun. Sa indicators tayo babawi kung paano natin maiangat yung empowerment ng kababayan. And also, let us not forget, meron din na ring framework si Longwe, yung WAC-PC, welfare, access, conscientization, participation, and yung control. So we could work it out, yung mga frameworks na yon, na para ma-empower natin ang mga kababayan, especially in the agriculture sector.
All right, thank you for those comments and manifestations. We are really running out of time. May I request another participant for one final set of comments or insights from your end? Is anyone interested? Okay, from one of our online participants, John Paulo Barcelona from PCW. How can we integrate climate risk assessments into existing agricultural planning and investment processes in the Philippines, ensuring that these assessments are not just theoretical exercises, but are translated into concrete actions and resource allocations? Probably the responses here will be very long, but we have 10 minutes remaining, including the final manifestations from our resource speakers. So I would suggest that maybe our presenters and discussants, including their final statements, answers or responses to those two previous manifestations. So let's go on and hear from our resource speakers their final statements. May I start with Dr. Toots?
Okay, I thought it will not be me to start. Well, again, let me just congratulate both Agnes and Hazel for this exemplary work. I mean, this is just, you've already just begun. The hard part, though, is when you're trying to, as I said, institutionalize any work. I just remember when the SDGs were first being formulated way back in 2015, and there were already side comments on in the UN. I kept hearing even rich countries saying, 100 indicators, even 60 are just too much for us. And these people are they keep asking us to collect even more. So now he will be saying collect more. That's the hard part. And then the capacity, as I said, to be able to examine this and to eventually make sense out of this for policy use. And then making sure that the policymakers also understand what the statisticians write, because sometimes even the statistical reports tend to be very difficult. So that's the main challenge.
Mamsel, can you
Yeah.
give your final
Uh,
statements?
Yeah, I also echo that. I hope that Agnes and Hazel will continue their work on this, because it's really very important. But I would push you towards developing a shorter diagnostic tool that could be used together with your more comprehensive module. Again, for some of the considerations that have been highlighted by TOTS, like in terms of cost and capacity building requirements. But I'd also like to encourage you to say that you just have to be patient based on my experience. I developed the CBMS in 1994, and it was only institutionalized in 2019. So just a few more years. But congratulations again. Thank you.
Mamsel. Dr. Hazel, your final
Yes.
statements.
Thank you. When we were putting together the index, I made a very aggressive suggestion to cut it down to 4 indicators, 1 per domain. That got quickly shut down, unfortunately. And it was not, after doing all the analysis, I had to relent and say, okay, we need more depth, or more breadth. So we take your point around length. We will try our best to streamline it more, but we need our input from our implementing partners. So please stay tuned. I want to make a call on this point again around capacity, a call to all our students and future fellows in NEDA and PIDS and all our other universities out there, all the future researchers, right? You're the capacity, right, in the future. And I think in the WEAI, one of the reasons for its success is that we brought in a lot of theses and dissertations were written using WEAI data. We would love to see a lot of students using women's data and WEAI data, because having that writing those papers on the Philippines, I think, will build that evidence, and it will help us both make the case, first build capacity, but also make the case for what we learn when we collect this information. So I'll end there. Thanks.
Thanks, Hazel. I want to go back to the point. Gusto kong balikan sana yung point niyo, sir, kasi maganda yung punto niyo na kailangan titingnan din yung empowerment ng mga kalalakihan. Para sa akin, gender equality is really being able to address yung issues ng mga kababaihan at kalalakihan. It's like walking on 2 legs. You can't have one without the other. But I think the nice thing about these tools is that because we collect data on women and because we collect data on men, we can really identify and diagnose the problems. Magkaiba ang mga problema at ng mga babae at lalaki. So, then intervention should be designed for that. So, for example, sa workplace, I think men are more likely to be in dangerous work situations and may be exposed to different kinds of violence which are not sexually related. Gang violence, dukutan, yung crime, ganon. I mean, I think these issues are gendered too. So I think that a comprehensive look at the situation will take that into account. My last plug also is with Hazel, same as Hazel's last plug, is that as we generate data, please let's use them. So I want to let people who are at the UP School of Economics know that I am offering a course in quantitative approaches in gender and development, Econ 293. Mag-enroll kayo. Sorry, virtual lang. Pero, I do come to the Philippines from time to time. And maraming salamat to PIDS for hosting us. It's great to be back. It's good to be home.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Agnes. And of course, for our panel members, excellent presentations and insights. Before we close, may I request our president to come forward to award certificates of appreciation to our invited presenters. Dr. Abela, Toots, can you also assist?
Salamat. May picture.
Dr. Hazel. Very good. So let's give everyone a very big round of applause. So before we officially close the program, let me announce the raffle winners for this morning's event. So we usually select one from Zoom and one from Facebook. This time around, we have 3. So from Zoom, we have Ms. Marianne de Breja from the United Nations Development Program. And from our on-site participants, we have 2 raffle winners. Mr. Eugene Puente III from the Department of Agriculture. And Ms. Kaiseline Kamagay from the National Commission on Indigenous Peoples. Congratulations for our online participant who won. We'll be in touch for your prize. Okay. So congratulations to all our winners. The PIDS Tech team will coordinate with you. So once again, we appreciate your attendance today. The speakers' presentations will be made available in our social media platforms as well as our main page. So please help us improve our events by answering our feedback form through the link provided in the Zoom chat box as well as the Facebook comment section. Please know that your e-certificate of participation will be automatically generated once you fill out those feedback forms. Your feedback and recommendations will make our upcoming events better. So keep in touch. You may follow PIDS on Facebook, Twitter, or X, and our YouTube channels for more updates. Also, feel free to visit our websites for more information, as well as if you want to download our research materials. Join us in another PIDS event this month. On August 29, we'll have another webinar titled Policy Dialogue, Results of the Economic and Social Survey of Asia and the Pacific via Zoom. So we cordially invite you as well in our upcoming events in the celebration of the Development Policy Research Month in September. You may visit the DPRM website of PIDS for the lineup of activities. For your information, September is the busiest month for PIDS as we celebrate the Development Policy Research Month. And with, of course, PIDS heading most of the major activities for the month-long celebration. We'll culminate with an annual public policy forum, I think in September 19. So all of you are also invited to view our online live feed, as well as you may attend the event face-to-face. So we'll be finalizing as well the venue for those events. Okay, so I think we only have to thank everyone for your attendance and of course our invited presenters for their very, very nice and insightful presentations. Let's take a group picture as your souvenir for attending this very interesting event. Please come forward, all of you. Lahat po tayo, punta tayo sa front for that very important picture. So another proof that you have attended and participated in this very significant presentation. Dito. Come forward. Yeah, hindi kayo makukuha dyan. PIDSEA Chair, please